The morning air in the prestigious Lincoln Park neighborhood of Chicago was biting a precursor to the harsh winter that always seemed to loom over the Great Lakes. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the city was still draped in a heavy charcoal-colored mist, and the streetlights cast long, flickering shadows against the grand stone facades. David Ames stepped out of his towering brownstone, his polished black shoes clicking sharply against the cold marble steps as he adjusted the collar of his expensive wool coat. At 35 years old, David was a man who had built a real estate empire from nothing but grit and a cold, calculating mind that viewed the world as a series of spreadsheets. His life was a masterpiece of order and predictability, a silent fortress where he lived alone, surrounded by the finest things money could buy, but very little that could actually breathe. He had never married, never sought the chaotic warmth of a family, and, honestly, he believed his black sedan and his high-rise office were all the companions he would ever truly need. As he reached the bottom step, however, his routine, a sacred liturgy of financial news and black coffee, was shattered by the presence of something that did not belong in his meticulously curated world. Resting against his front door was a small hand-woven wicker basket, half hidden by a soft, pale blue blanket that fluttered slightly in the wind. At first, David froze, his mind racing through possibilities ranging from a misplaced delivery to some elaborate strange joke played by a rival developer. He stood there for a long moment, the wind whistling through the bare branches of the oak trees, before he finally reached down with a gloved hand to pull back the edge of the fabric. His heart, usually as steady as a clock, skipped a beat as he looked down into the sleeping face of a tiny infant who couldn't have been more than 3 months old. The child was deep in a peaceful slumber, his small chest rising and falling with a rhythmic grace that seemed to defy the freezing Chicago morning. A small cream-colored note was tucked into the corner of the basket, the ink slightly smeared as if by a trembling hand, or perhaps a fallen tear. It was written in an elegant but shaky script that simply pleaded for David to look after the child because the writer had no other choice, and prayed for God to bless him for his mercy. David looked up and down the empty street, the sidewalk illuminated only by the pale glow of the morning, but there was no one in sight, no car speeding away, and no sound but the distant hum of the city. He felt a strange cold sensation in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in many years, something that wasn't quite fear, but was certainly far removed from his usual professional indifference. The baby moved slightly in his sleep, a tiny fist curling against his cheek, and for a split second, David saw a vulnerability that mirrored something deep within his own locked-away soul. He stood there for several minutes, a powerful man paralyzed by a 10-pound basket, his mind shouting that he should call the authorities or the police immediately. He was a man of logic and law, and the proper procedure for an abandoned child was clear and documented in several municipal codes he knew by heart. Yet as he looked at the clean new clothes the baby wore, and the small stuffed bear tucked beside him, he realized that this wasn't a random act of neglect. Someone had chosen his door, specifically. Someone had trusted him with the most precious thing they owned, and that realization felt like a heavy weight pressing against his ribs. The baby's breathing was soft and irregular, a fragile thread of life that seemed too delicate for the harsh concrete world David inhabited. Without consciously deciding to do so, he reached down and lifted the basket, surprised by how light it felt, and carried it back inside the warmth of his silent mansion. Inside the grand foyer, surrounded by original artwork and cold marble floors, David set the basket on a mahogany table and stared at the child as if he were an alien visitor. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, feeling the sweat start to break across his forehead despite the chill of the house. He knew nothing about children, having spent his entire adult life avoiding them in favor of boardrooms and luxury hotels, where the only sounds were the soft clink of crystal. He didn't know how to change a diaper. He didn't know what kind of milk a 3-month-old required, and the very thought of the responsibility made him want to flee. But as he stood there, the silence of the house felt different, no longer a mark of his success, but a hollow space that this tiny intruder had already begun to fill. The sound of a key turning in the lock startled him, and he turned to see Teresa Miller entering through the side door as she did every morning at 7 o'clock. Teresa was 24 years old, a quiet and incredibly efficient woman who had worked as his housekeeper for the past 2 years, without ever once being late or causing a moment of friction. She was a woman of few words, always dressed in a neat uniform, moving through the house like a ghost who kept the machinery of his life running smoothly. But as she stepped into the foyer and saw David standing over a wicker basket with a look of utter panic on his face, her usual composure vanished. Her face went as white as the marble beneath her feet, and she dropped her bag on the floor, her dark eyes wide with a shock that seemed to go deeper than mere surprise. "A baby," she whispered, her voice barely a breath of wind, and she moved toward the table with a strange hypnotic grace. David watched her, noticing for the first time the way her hands were shaking as she reached out toward the basket, her eyes filling with tears that she tried desperately to blink away. He explained how he had found the child on the steps, his voice sounding rough and foreign to his own ears, as he spoke of the note and the empty street. Teresa didn't seem to be listening to his words as much as she was absorbing the sight of the child, her entire being focused on the tiny face inside the blanket. She looked as if she were seeing a ghost, or perhaps a miracle, and the intensity of her reaction made David feel even more out of place in his own home. "He is beautiful," she murmured, her voice cracking as she finally reached out to touch the baby's cheek with the back of her hand. David noticed that the baby didn't wake, but seemed to lean into her touch, a small sigh escaping his lips, as if he recognized the warmth of her skin. In that moment, David felt a sudden and inexplicable shift in the air of the room, a sense that the order of his life had been permanently altered by this small breathing mystery. He looked at Teresa and saw not just his housekeeper, but a woman possessed by a fierce protective instinct that he couldn't begin to understand. The silence of the morning was gone, replaced by the heavy, unspoken questions that now hung between them in the cold Chicago light. "Sastudi." Teresa immediately took charge of the situation with a competence that left David feeling both relieved and deeply curious about the woman who had cleaned his floors for 2 years. She didn't ask questions about what they should do or suggest calling the police. Instead, she walked straight to the kitchen and began heating a small pot of water with practiced movements. She told David that they needed to see if the child was hungry, and that they would need supplies immediately if they were going to keep him comfortable for the next few hours. Her voice was steady now, though her eyes remained bright, with an emotion David couldn't quite name, a mixture of profound sadness and a strange, glowing hope. She moved through the kitchen with a confidence she had never shown before, her quiet nature replaced by a sense of urgent maternal purpose. "I know how to care for babies," she said softly, when David asked how she seemed to know exactly what to do. She explained that she had younger siblings and had been helping her mother since she was a small girl. But there was something in the way she said it that felt like a half-math. David watched her as she returned to the foyer and lifted the baby from the basket, holding him against her chest, with a natural ease that made the child look like he had been born to be there. The baby woke up, then his large dark eyes blinking in the light of the house, and instead of crying, he simply stared up at Teresa with a look of quiet recognition. It was a moment of such profound peace that David found himself unable to look away, his own cold heart feeling a sudden sharp pang of something that felt dangerously like affection. They decided that they needed to go to the store immediately, as David had absolutely nothing in the house that could sustain a small child. He told Teresa to bring the baby, and they would take his car, a decision that would have seemed insane to him only an hour ago, putting a strange child in his pristine leather interior. As they drove through the quiet streets of the city toward a 24-hour department store, the silence in the car was heavy with the weight of the unknown. David found himself checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, not to watch the traffic, but to catch a glimpse of the child in Teresa's arms. She sat in the back seat, whispering to the baby, in a language David didn't recognize her voice, a low melodic hum that seemed to soothe the infant into a state of perfect calm. At the store, David stood back and watched as Teresa moved through the aisles with a laser-like focus, selecting formula diapers, soft cotton onesies, and a proper bassinet. He simply followed behind her, with the cart paying for everything with a gold card that had never before been used to purchase something as humble as a pacifier or a jar of baby lotion. The total came to several $100s a drop in the ocean for a man like David, but as he carried the heavy bags back to the car, he felt as if he were investing in something far more valuable than real estate. He saw the way Teresa looked at the items, her eyes lingering on a small blue hat with tiny bare ears, and he realized that for her, these weren't just supplies. They were symbols of a care she was desperate to provide. Back at the house, they spent the next 2 hours transforming one of the empty guest rooms into a makeshift nursery. David found himself assembling the bassinet with a set of tools he hadn't touched in years, his expensive suit jacket tossed over a chair as he worked on his hands and knees. Teresa organized the clothes and prepared the first bottle, her movements synchronized with his, in a way that felt strangely familiar, as if they had been doing this for years instead of hours. When the room was finally ready, it no longer looked like a cold museum piece for guests. It looked like a place of life filled with the scent of lavender and baby powder. David stood in the doorway watching as Teresa fed the baby, the morning sun finally breaking through the clouds and spilling across the floor in long golden ribbons. "What should we call him?" David asked, his voice low, so as not to disturb the quiet moment. Teresa didn't even hesitate, her eyes fixed on the baby's face, as she replied that his name should be Samuel. She said it with such certainty that David didn't even think to argue, the name Samuel echoing in the room like a bell that had finally found its clapper. He liked the sound of it, strong, classic, and somehow fitting for the little boy who had appeared out of the mist to change his life. He watched as Samuel drifted off to sleep again, his small hand wrapped around Teresa's thumb, and for the first time in his 35 years, David felt a sense of peace that had nothing to do with his bank account or his social standing. As the day progressed, David realized that he couldn't simply go back to his office and pretend that none of this had happened. He called his assistant Logan and told him that he would be working from home for the foreseeable future, offering no explanation other than a family emergency. He could hear the shock in Logan's voice, but he didn't care. The world of skyscrapers and mergers felt miles away, separated by the thick walls of his home and the presence of the child. He spent the afternoon in his study, but his eyes kept drifting toward the door, listening for the sound of a cry or the soft murmur of Teresa's voice. He felt as if he were waiting for something, though he wasn't sure what, a sense of anticipation that made his skin prickle with a strange, nervous energy. That evening he found Teresa in the kitchen, her face lined with exhaustion, but her eyes still glowing with that same fierce light. He told her that he had been thinking, and that it made no sense for her to commute back and forth from her apartment while the baby needed constant care. He offered her the guest room next to Samuel's nursery, telling her that she could stay there as long as she needed to and that he would handle all the expenses. He saw the way she froze, her hand hovering over the counter, and for a moment he feared he had overstepped some invisible boundary. But then she looked at him, and the gratitude in her eyes was so intense that it made him feel small and undeserving. She accepted the offer with a soft, "Thank you," and David knew that the fortress of his solitude had finally and perhaps permanently been breached. The first week of Samuel's residence in the Ames mansion was a blur of sleepless nights and a steep learning curve that challenged every one of David's assumptions about his own capabilities. He found himself waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning to the sound of soft crying, his body reacting with an urgency that he didn't know he possessed. He would stumble down the hallway in his silk pajamas, only to find Teresa already there, her hair loose and her face tired, but her arms always ready to receive the child. They would sit together in the dim light of the nursery, the only sound being the soft creak of the rocking chair and the rhythmic sucking of the bottle. In those quiet, dark hours, the barriers of class and employment seemed to dissolve, replaced by a shared mission that was as old as humanity itself. David's friends and business associates began to notice his absence, and the rumors started to circulate through the elite circles of Chicago's financial district. One afternoon, his friend Derek, a boisterous attorney who had known David since their university days, stopped by unannounced with a bottle of expensive scotch and a look of deep suspicion. When David opened the door, dressed in a wrinkled t-shirt and holding a burp cloth over his shoulder, Derek nearly dropped the bottle. He pushed his way inside, his eyes widening as he saw the bassinet in the living room and heard the soft gurgle of a baby from the next room. David didn't even try to explain the complexity of the situation, simply stating that he was looking after a relative's child. But Derek's laughter echoed through the house, like a discordant note in a beautiful symphony. "You, David Ames, the man who once fired an intern for having a messy desk, are playing house with a foundling." Derek asked, his voice full of a mockery that David suddenly found incredibly grating. He looked at his friend, a man he had once admired for his sharp wit and cynical outlook, and realized that they no longer spoke the same language. David didn't care about the scotch or the latest gossip about the city council. He only cared that the loud noise might wake Samuel from his afternoon nap. He ushered Derek out the door with a coldness that surprised even himself, realizing that the people who had defined his world were now nothing more than background noise to the reality of the life growing inside his home. As the days turned into weeks, David began to notice things about Teresa that he had never seen in the 2 years she had spent cleaning his house. She was an avid reader, often found with a book of poetry or a classic novel when Samuel was sleeping, her mind as sharp and observant as his own. She had a way of looking at the world with a quiet wisdom that made his own aggressive pursuit of success seem hollow and one-dimensional. He started to look forward to their shared meals, which were no longer the silent affairs of the past, but were now filled with conversations about everything from the history of Chicago to the best ways to encourage a baby to crawl. He found himself asking for her opinion on things not just about the baby, but about life itself, discovering a depth of character in her that he found increasingly intoxicating. However, there was a shadow that hung over their new domestic bliss, a secret that David could sense but couldn't quite grasp. He noticed the way Teresa would sometimes stare at Samuel with a look of such profound longing that it felt like a physical ache in the room. He saw the way she would sometimes pull a small weathered photograph from her pocket when she thought he wasn't looking, her fingers tracing the edges with a devotion that bordered on the religious. He didn't want to pry, knowing that everyone had a past they were entitled to keep, but the mystery of Teresa Miller began to occupy his thoughts, as much as the future of the child they were raising together. He felt as if they were both living in a beautiful bubble that was destined to pop, and the fear of that moment began to haunt his dreams. One evening, David was working late in his study when he heard the sound of Samuel crying, a sharp, distressed sound that was different from his usual hungry whimper. He rushed to the nursery and found Teresa standing over the bassinet, her face buried in her hands as she sobbed silently, her body shaking with an ancient grief. Samuel was fine, just startled by a loud car outside, but Teresa looked as if she were falling apart. David moved toward her, his hand reaching out to touch her shoulder, but he hesitated, unsure of how to comfort a woman who had become so much more than an employee. He finally spoke her name, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of her emotion, and she looked up at him with eyes that were red and raw with pain. "I can't do this, David," she whispered, her voice breaking on his name, and for the first time she didn't call him Mr. Ames. She told him that the guilt was eating her alive, that every time she looked at Samuel, she saw the ghost of the life she had been forced to leave behind. She spoke of a mother who had loved her child more than anything, but had been broken by the world left, with nothing but a wicker basket and a desperate hope. David listened, his heart heavy with the realization that the foundling on his doorstep hadn't been a stranger at all. He looked at the baby, then back at Teresa, and the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place with a sickening thud. He knew then, without her having to say it, that the mother she was mourning was herself. The silence that followed her confession was so thick it felt like it might suffocate them both. David stood there, the man of logic and law, and realized that his world had just shifted on its axis once again. He didn't feel the anger he expected, or the sense of betrayal he had always imagined he would feel if someone lied to him so profoundly. Instead, he felt a deep, soul-shaking compassion for the woman standing before him, a woman who had been willing to give up her own heart, to give her son a chance at a life she couldn't provide. He looked at the luxury of the room, the expensive toys and the soft blankets, and realized that none of it mattered compared to the raw, unfiltered love that Teresa had for the boy in the bassinet. Sifi Madi. The revelation that Teresa was Samuel's biological mother did not shatter the house as David had feared. Instead, it acted like a bridge connecting two souls who had both been living in their own versions of isolation. After that night in the nursery, the air between them became lighter, stripped of the heavy veil of deception that had kept them at a professional distance. David didn't ask her to leave, and he didn't call the authorities. He simply sat with her on the floor of the nursery and listened to the full story of her struggle. She told him about the father who had vanished the moment he saw the 2 lines on the test, about the eviction notices, and the cold nights in a tiny apartment where the heater never worked. She spoke of the day she stood on his doorstep, her heart breaking into 1,000 pieces as she walked away, and how she had prayed every hour that he would be the man she hoped he was. David found himself moved by her bravery, a word he had previously reserved for soldiers and explorers, but now saw reflected in the quiet strength of a mother who had faced the abyss for her child. He realized that his own life, for all its wealth and status, had been a form of cowardice, a way to avoid the messy, painful, and beautiful reality of human connection. He began to see Samuel not just as a responsibility he had accepted, but as a gift he hadn't known. He needed a living bridge to a better version of himself. He spent more time at home, not because he had to, but because he wanted to be there for every milestone, every smile, and every moment of growth. The office in the city became a distant thought, a place where he used to pretend that numbers were the only things that mattered. As the weeks turned into months, the relationship between David and Teresa evolved into something that defied simple labels. They were partners in every sense of the word, sharing the burdens and the joys of parenthood with a synchronicity that often left them both surprised. They would go for long walks through Lincoln Park, pushing the stroller past the zoo and the conservatory, looking for all the world like a young, successful family. David found himself buying things not just for Samuel, but for Teresa as well. Books she had mentioned, a warm coat for the Chicago winters, and eventually a beautiful piece of jewelry that he gave her on a quiet Tuesday evening, just because he liked the way her eyes lit up when she was happy. However, the world outside their brownstone was not as accepting of their unconventional arrangement. David's sister Diane, a socialite who lived in the suburbs and prided herself on her perfect manicured life, came to visit, and was horrified to find her brother cohabiting with his housekeeper and a child of unknown origin. She sat in the living room, her nose wrinkled, as if she could smell something unpleasant, and lectured David on the importance of his reputation and the legacy of the Ames name. She told him that he was being manipulated by a woman who clearly saw him as a meal ticket, and that he needed to wake up before he became the laughingstock of the city. David listened to her with a calm that bordered on indifference, realizing that her perfect life was as hollow and cold as his own used to be. "You don't understand, Diane," he said softly, his voice full of a conviction that left no room for argument. He told her that for 35 years he had been building a monument to himself, and it had been a lonely, freezing place to live. He explained that Teresa and Samuel hadn't taken anything from him. They had given him back his soul, showing him that the only legacy worth having was the love you left behind in the hearts of others. Diane left in a huff, her heels clicking angrily on the marble, but David didn't even look after her. He went back to the kitchen where Teresa was showing Samuel how to mash a banana, and the sound of their laughter was the only validation he required. One evening, as they were putting Samuel to bed, Teresa looked at David with a seriousness that made his heart skip a beat. She told him that she had been thinking about the future, and that she didn't want Samuel to grow up in a world of secrets, even if those secrets were meant to protect him. She wanted him to know the truth of his birth, of her struggle, and of the man who had opened his doors to two strangers when they had nowhere else to go. David agreed, realizing that the truth was the only foundation strong enough to support the family they were building. He took her hand, his fingers interlaced with hers, and promised that they would tell the story together when the time was right, as a testament to the power of a second chance. As the first birthday of Samuel approached, David realized that he wanted to make their family official in the eyes of the world. He spent weeks searching for the perfect ring, not something that shouted about his wealth, but something that whispered about his devotion. He chose a classic sapphire, the color of the Chicago sky on a clear summer day, and he planned a quiet dinner at home, away from the prying eyes of the city. He was more nervous than he had ever been before a major business merger, his hands shaking as he lit the candles and checked the temperature of the wine. He knew that what he was asking was more than just a marriage proposal. It was a commitment to a life that would always be defined by the wicker basket on the doorstep. When the moment finally came, David didn't use a grand speech or a practiced monologue. He simply looked at Teresa, a woman who had taught him more about life in 1 year than he had learned in 3 decades, and told her that he couldn't imagine a future that didn't include her and Samuel by his side. He asked her to be his wife, to be the mother of his children, and to continue the journey they had started in the charcoal-colored mist of that October morning. Teresa's answer was not a word, but a tear that fell onto the sapphire as she pulled him into an embrace that felt like coming home. They stood there in the quiet of the mansion, two people who had found each other in the most improbable of ways, ready to face the world as a united front. The wedding was a small private affair held in the garden of their home, attended only by a few close friends who had remained loyal throughout the transition. Samuel, now a sturdy toddler in a tiny tuxedo, served as the unofficial ring-bearer, his joyful shouts, puncturing the solemnity of the ceremony in a way that made everyone laugh. As David looked at his bride, dressed in a simple, elegant white gown that made her look like a queen, he felt a sense of completion that he had never thought possible. He realized that the empire he had spent his life building was nothing compared to the kingdom of his own home, a place where he was loved not for his bank account, but for the man he had become under the influence of a small child and a brave woman. Life after the wedding was a beautiful, chaotic dance of growth and discovery. David sold his interest in several high-stress commercial developments and shifted his focus to philanthropy, specifically funding programs for single mothers and early childhood education in the underserved neighborhoods of Chicago. He used his business acumen to build bridges instead of walls, finding a new kind of success that couldn't be measured in quarterly earnings. Teresa went back to school to finish her degree in education, her dream of becoming a teacher finally within her reach, supported by a husband who believed in her as much as she believed in herself. They were a team, a partnership that grew stronger with every challenge and every victory. Samuel grew into a bright, inquisitive boy who carried the best traits of both his parents, Teresa's quiet wisdom and David's sharp intellect. He loved the stories they told him, especially the one about the magic basket that had brought them all together on a cold morning long ago. They never hid the truth from him, explaining that family wasn't just about blood, but about the choice to show up for each other every single day. Samuel understood it in the way that only children can, accepting the complexity of his history, with a grace that made David incredibly proud. He saw himself as the luckiest boy in Chicago, a child who had two people willing to move heaven and earth to keep him safe and happy. As the years passed, the Ames mansion became a hub of activity, no longer a silent fortress, but a house filled with the sounds of children and the warmth of a true home. They had two more children, a girl named Anna and a boy named Joseph, who completed the family in ways David hadn't even imagined. The house was always cluttered with toys and books, and the kitchen was a place of constant creation, a far cry from the days of silent, catered meals. David found that he didn't miss his old life at all. The man who had once been obsessed with order had learned to find beauty in the beautiful mess of a living, breathing family. He was a man who had finally learned how to breathe. One winter evening, as the snow fell softly outside the windows of their Lincoln Park home, David sat in his favorite chair, watching his children play on the rug, while Teresa read a book by the fireplace. He felt a profound sense of gratitude for the cold madrugada in October that had changed everything. He looked at his wife, her face softened by the glow of the fire, and realized that the greatest risk he had ever taken wasn't a business deal or a financial gamble. It was the moment he reached down and picked up a wicker basket. He realized that life was a series of doors, and the most important ones were often the ones we were most afraid to open. David took a deep breath, the scent of wood smoke and evergreen filling his lungs, and closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about all the people out there who were still living in their own fortresses, afraid of the chaos of love and the vulnerability of connection. He wished he could tell them that the only way to truly live was to let the world in, even if it came in the form of a shivering baby on a cold doorstep. He felt a small hand tugging at his sleeve and opened his eyes to see Samuel, now a tall, handsome teenager, looking at him with a smile that mirrored his own. "Are you okay, Dad?" Samuel asked, and the word Dad still made David's heart swell with an emotion that words could never fully capture. "I'm more than okay, Sam," David replied, pulling his son into a brief, strong hug. I'm exactly where I was always meant to be." He looked around the room at the life he had built, not out of stone and steel, but out of love and second chances, and realized that he was the wealthiest man he had ever known. The Chicago wind might howl outside their windows, and the winters might be long and harsh, but inside the walls of his home, it was always spring. He had found his purpose, his partner, and his peace, and he knew that as long as they were together, the charcoal-colored mist of the past would never be able to reach them again. As the seasons of life continued to turn, David found himself reflecting more and more on the profound lessons that had been woven into the fabric of his journey. He had reached an age where the frantic pace of youth had slowed into a steady, thoughtful rhythm, allowing him to see the patterns of his life with a clarity that only time can provide. He realized that the human heart is a remarkable thing capable of being frozen by ambition and yet thawed by the simplest act of kindness. He saw that his early success had been a hollow victory, because he had been playing a game where the only prize was more of the same, a cycle of acquisition that never led to true satisfaction. It was only when he stepped outside of himself and accepted the responsibility for another life that he finally understood what it meant to be a man of substance. He often thought about the concept of timing and how we often believe we are in control of the schedule of our lives. He had planned to be a titan of industry, but the universe had a different plan, one that involved a wicker basket and a trembling note. He learned that the most important moments in life are rarely the ones we prepare for. They are the ones that catch us off guard, the ones that require us to abandon our spreadsheets and listen to the quiet voice of our conscience. He realized that a life lived strictly by the book is a life that misses the best chapters, the ones written in the margins, and the footnotes where the real magic happens. He learned to welcome the unexpected, seeing it not as an intrusion, but as an invitation to grow. The lesson of forgiveness was perhaps the most difficult, and yet the most rewarding one he had ever mastered. He had to learn to forgive himself for the coldness of his past, and he had to help Teresa forgive herself for the desperation of her choices. He saw that we are all at our core flawed beings, doing the best we can with the tools we have at the time. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing the past, but about releasing its grip on the future, allowing for a new story to be told. He realized that the bridges we build between each other are made of the same materials as the walls we put up. The difference is in the architecture of the heart. He learned that holding on to a grudge is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, a realization that brought a profound sense of lightness to his soul. David also learned that family is not a noun, but a verb. It is something you do, something you create, through 1,000 small acts of devotion and sacrifice. It isn't defined by a common surname or a shared genetic code, but by the commitment to stay in the room when things get difficult. He saw that the strongest families are the ones that have been tested by fire and have come out tempered and resilient, held together by the invisible threads of shared history and mutual respect. He learned that love isn't a feeling you wait for. It's a decision you make over and over again every single morning when you wake up and choose to put someone else's needs before your own. This was the true wealth he had accumulated, a fortune that could never be taxed or taken away by a market crash. Finally, he realized that the legacy of a person isn't found in the buildings they leave behind or the companies they found, but in the echoes of their kindness in the lives of those they touched. He looked at Samuel, Teresa, and their other children, and saw the living proof of his own transformation. He saw that by opening his door to one child, he had opened his heart to a world of possibilities that had once seemed impossible. He understood that we are all connected in ways we can barely perceive, and that a single act of mercy can ripple outward, changing the destiny of people we will never even meet. As he sat in the twilight of his years looking out over the city of Chicago, he knew that his life had been a masterpiece after all, not because it was perfect, but because it was full of love. This was the ultimate truth he had discovered, that at the end of the day, when the accounts are settled and the lights grow dim, the only thing that truly remains is the love we gave, and the love we were brave enough to receive.